Hi, everyone. Good afternoon, and welcome to the Basics of the Clerkship Application hosted by the American Constitution Society. My name is Thea Cohen. I am the Director of Strategic Engagement here. I'm now going to turn things over to Judge Gia Cobb on the U.S. District Court for the District of Columbia for some opening remarks. So, Cobb.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for having me. I'm really happy to be able to speak to you about judicial clerkships and to kick off what I know will be a very informative session. I cannot say enough about the value and benefits of a judicial clerkship, both from the perspective of someone who clerked after law school and now as a judge who works closely with law clerks every day. After law school, I clerked for Judge Diane Wood, who is now retired from the Seventh Circuit, and just a couple of months ago went to a law clerk reunion. So it was great to see her and to see my fellow co-clerks. And the point is that even all of these years later, we still very much feel like a clerkship family. I learned so much from her during that experience, not just about writing and analysis and being a good advocate, but also about work ethic and leading a full and balanced life. And now as a judge, I can tell you that hiring and working with law clerks is probably the most important thing that I do and has the most direct correlation to the work that I perform. My clerks work with me on every aspect of my cases. They discuss case resolution with me. They help me draft opinions. They help me prepare for sentencings. I'm actually right now in the second of several back-to-back trials. As soon as I'm done with my remarks, I'll get back on the bench to resume the trial. And my law clerks have a literal front row seat to not only observing the mechanics of the trial and learning about in-court advocacy, but also all the behind-the-scenes work that goes into preparing voir dire and ruling on motions and preparing jury instructions. In my view, clerking is probably the best thing that you can do to prepare for your legal career, particularly if you want to do litigation, but even if you have aspirations to use your law degree outside the courtroom. In hiring law clerks, and I'm speaking from my perspective as a district court judge, I'm looking for people who already have strong research and writing skills and are ready to hit the ground running to help me dive into the docket. I'm looking for people who have taken Black letter law classes, who have worked on law school journals, and have used their summer experiences to gain valuable writing experience. And I'm also looking to recommenders who know the candidates well and can vouch for them beyond just being able to say that the candidate was a student that did well in the professor's class. With that being said, though, things are a lot different now than they used to be. In my day when I was applying for clerkships, the online application system is, of course, very convenient. On my end, I love that I can sort applications and keep track of everything and have everything in one place. But it also makes it very easy for people to apply to as many judges as they want with the stroke of a button. And as a result, the number of applications that judges gets larger every year. So I wanted to leave you with just a few things to think about as you launch into your discussion. First, I want to say don't be discouraged. I am convinced that I could review the same set of applications and come up with a completely different set of law clerks from that same set each year. And I have hired law clerks who I somehow missed in what I thought was a careful review of the pile the first time around. If you don't happen to get the clerkship you were hoping to get on your first try, don't worry. If it is something that you want to do, don't hesitate to reapply even after you've graduated. In fact, there are many judges who will only hire people who have work experience. And of course, after graduation, you're not tied to the timeline of the plan, so you can actually increase your chances by waiting. But even so, put your best foot forward the first time you apply, and of course, anytime you apply. Obviously, grades are important, so do as best as you can in school, but also seek out working on journals or other writing opportunities and really focus on improving your writing and honing that skill while you are in law school. Over your summers and in school, think about developing a writing sample, particularly something that's unedited or largely unedited by another person. Make real connections with your professors in your clinicals and during legal internships. As I said earlier, recommendations are very important, and I can certainly tell the glowing ones from the obligatory ones. And if your law school has clerkship resources, use them. If you have top choices for clerkships, and I'll give a caveat that some schools I've found out tell you not to do this, but I'm telling you it actually resonates with me. So take this as you will. But I suggest that you let that judge know in your cover letter. Let the judge know why you want to clerk for them in your cover letter if there is a particular reason. Research and apply widely. You can be anywhere for a year and can have a really great experience, even if it's not a city that you're familiar with. Prepare for your interview. Know something about the cases the judge has recently decided. Be prepared to discuss your writing sample and resume. I always ask applicants about an area of law that they are interested in or following to try to have a substantive discussion with them about whatever topic they want to discuss. And I do this because I want to make sure that the law clerks I hire are intellectually curious and actually like law and like reading cases and discussing them, because that is what we do often in chambers. And finally, think about the reason that you want to clerk. It is a rewarding job, but it does require a lot of work. So make sure you want to do it and that you're up for the challenge. So again, thank you so much for having me. It's been great speaking with you. I hope that all of you will consider clerking, and I wish you the best of luck as you navigate that process.
Thank you so much, Judge Cobb. That was wonderful and so helpful.
Okay, thank you.
Have a good luck with your trial.
Okay, thank you.
All right. So that was great. We some wonderful advice there. I want to dive right into it since we only have an hour. I just have a little bit of housekeeping at the top. There is a question and answer box. Please put your questions in there. We will save some time at the end, though if a question is relevant, a panelist may choose to answer it as we go. I also just want to talk about a couple of other resources that ACS has beyond programs like this. I am available to speak with any ACS member who is interested in clerkships. I can give advice and talk to you about your options. We also do programming at your school. If you want to do a clerkship program, we can help you find local judges, alums, things like that to come talk about applications more specifically to your law school and the process coming from there. And I also want to highlight two programs that we have that'll be coming up down the line this winter and spring. Our mentor matching program is basically exactly what it sounds like. We utilize our network to find people who have clerked and match them with law students or new graduates who are interested in clerking. A lot of people on this panel have been mentors or have had mentors through ACS, and it's been a great program. We also have a smaller group of our clerkship assistants cohort, and those are the people that ACS looks at as our, the future of the legal profession. We help you with the clerkship process, connecting you with a lot of people in our network to help maximize your chances and stand out in, as Judge Cobb mentioned, what is a very crowded field. So take a look out for that. I am going to be on leave starting from now through November 11th, but after that, anyone who wants to talk about clerkships, please reach out to me and I'll put my email in the chat. So without further ado, my wonderful panelists, I'd like to introduce all of you. First, we have Isabella Aguilar, who is clerking now on the Northern District of Illinois for Judge Mary Rowland. Chuck Alcock, who is a former law clerk to Justice Fiti Alsunia on the High Court of American Samoa. Rashmi Bora, the former law clerk to Judge Todd Hughes on the Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit. And Jake Mazadis, the former law clerk to Justice Melissa Hart on the Colorado Supreme Court, and the current law clerk to Judge Robert Bacharach on the 10th Circuit. So Judge Cobb mentioned the Oscar plan in her talk, and I want to talk a little bit more about how that goes, because that is probably definitely the easiest and probably the most common way that people apply to clerkships. It's a database online with that many, not all, federal judges participate in. You will have access to it starting in January of your 2L year. You'll be able to see the judges, see what their posts are, what they ask for, but you won't be able to officially apply until this year. It's going to be June 9th. And at noon on June 9th, all of your applications will go out to the judges. They will then have 24 hours to review those applications and decide who they want to reach out to for interviews. After that time, they can start reaching out to people and do as many interviews as they want, and they can give offers right away. Those offers are supposed to stay open for 24 hours. As you can imagine, this process is stressful for students and judges. It can be quite chaotic. Some people get a lot of interviews, some people get none. It is very hard to stand out when the judge might get hundreds, or even for the really popular ones, maybe even thousands of applications. So while this is something that I would encourage anyone who's interested in clerking for federal courts to do, I also want to talk about all the different ways besides Oscar on the plan there are for people to get law clerks. It was put into place because judges ended up hiring people very earlier in their law school career. We're seeing now judges are hiring people much later in their law school career. As Judge Cobb mentioned, many of them are hiring people only with post-JD experience. So right now, I'd love to go around and ask each panelist to tell me sort of the procedural background of how they got their their clerkships, and we'll talk about the why of why they chose those courts in a minute. But Isabella, can we start with you? How did you get your clerkship? What was your process? Oh, I'm sorry, I can't hear you. All right. I think we're having some technical issues. So, all right. So Isabella's going to skip into call in. So I'm going to skip you. We'll go to Rashmi, and then I'll come back to you at the end once I think we'll get this figured out.
Sure. So I clerked for Judge Hughes during the 2022-2023 term, and I applied for my clerkships during the summer of 2020. So this was, for context, a couple months after COVID hit. We all had switched very rapidly to doing all the interviews and hiring processes through Zoom. I applied using a mix of Oscar as well as some direct email applications. And my interview with Judge Hughes, I got that through an email application with some support from a professor. And what I tell people when I talk about clerkships is that was, I think, my 9th interview. I had gone 0 for 8 up until this point. It was very stressful. And I remember thinking, like, at the end of the day, you just need one acceptance. So even though at the time it was very discouraging and stressful to have, a string of rejections leading up to the clerkship that I really, really wanted, ultimately I got the call, and it worked out. Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much. All right. Chuck, how about you?
Yeah, I threw my hat into the Oscar ring. I'd say it's hard. All these judges are getting so many applications, and I didn't get an interview through that. Fortunately, I had sort of an adventurous streak and decided to sort of look at these territorial courts, which I look forward to discussing more down the road. Saw a posting for the High Court of American Samoa I went to the University of Denver Stern College of Law. We have a service called Simplicity. I'm not sure how widespread that is. But through there's an email address, list of things to send off, combine it into a PDF, had a fancy title page, trying to stand out. That one worked. It was a one interview process with more than one judge of the court. So that was a little overwhelming. Remote, fortunately, as I imagine a lot of these territorial courts interviews would be. And yeah, I was fortunate enough to clerk for Justice VTA Sunia for the 2023-2024 term. So I'm excited to talk more about it.
Excellent. Thank you so much. All right, Jake, how about you?
Yeah, certainly. So I can speak a little to the state process, which is still kind of the Wild West. So this is kind of what the federal plan was before the plan. So for state courts, there is no kind of national standard for when jobs are open. Generally, I worked for a state Supreme Court, which is different than how maybe a state intermediate appellate court or a state trial court might do it. But for the courts that I was applying to, they generally opened in the spring of 2L. So for those courts that you're interested in applying to that are state Supreme Courts or state courts, you need to look them up individually. So I quite differently really did not apply to many judges. I applied to 2 state Supreme Court justices in probably February of my 2L year, and then got an interview in April and got an offer shortly thereafter, and then kind of canceled my other application. And then did the more standard Oscar application for Judge Bacharach, but only applying to judges that were 2 years out from law school, since I had a job for the 23-24 cycle. So I think that my path is a little different But the critical kind of takeaway is that when you're applying for state court jobs, you need to be very specific about the ones that you're interested in applying to and look up when they take applications, because it can span even on the same court. So at the Colorado Supreme Court, the justices hire at different times. Some of them hire quite early. Some of them hire, after the federal hiring has taken place for a particular class of 2Ls. I think last year the former Chief Justice Boatwright hadn't hired for the following year until quite soon. So, which is to say, you might miss some opportunities, but alternatively, there are almost always going to be judges who are hiring for any immediately upcoming years.
That's great. Thanks, Jake. And so it's true, there is no Oscar equivalent for state courts. There is, however, CORE, which is the Court Opportunity Recruitment for All. We're going to put a link to that in the chat, which doesn't have every state court. So you do have to do your research and do a lot more legwork for a state court, but there are some places that do try to aggregate the different opportunities where you can apply. Okay, great. So Isabella, are you here? I think still not yet. Okay. Well, we'll come back because I do want to hear about your process. But now I want to move on. And Jake, this is a good segue. We can keep going with you. You said you only applied to 2 state court judges. So it seems like you had a pretty, focused plan. Can you tell me what was your thought process and why you chose state courts, and why other people might be very interested in applying for state courts as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So the reason that I applied specifically to where I did is because I'm a bit of a brat, and I was very certain about what I wanted. And what I wanted was to work for, I'm really interested in state Supreme Courts. I'm interested in them academically. I want to be an academic who writes about state Supreme Courts, and I want to do kind of state appellate practice. So I was looking for people who were former law professors who sat on, I thought, intellectually interesting courts, preferably in the middle of the country, which is where I'm from, and people that I generally agreed with on kind of big issues. So that led me to all of 2 people, and then I applied to those 2 people. And because it was relatively early in the cycle, I was confident that if those didn't work out, I could apply to other people later. So it wasn't as if, I was applying to 2 people and then would never apply to anyone else. I applied to 2 people that I thought were interesting at the time, and then figured that later I would apply to other folks. So that was kind of why I applied to the people I did. In terms of state courts, I think that states are doing really interesting work. You just need to look at the headlines from national newspapers to see the relevance of state courts, both state trial courts and state Supreme Court. So while I was at the Colorado Supreme Court, took Donald Trump off the ballot under the 14th Amendment Insurrectionist Clause case, which was a pretty big deal. We worked on a lot of other LGBTQ rights issues, and it was a really exciting and kind of scary at times opportunity. So state courts matter a lot, and that's something hopefully that you all are getting kind of in your law schools. I'll say just a few things that distinguish federal and appellate court, or state and appellate or federal court clerkships, because I'm in a federal one now. I was in a state court last year. I'll just say that obviously as a matter of subject matter, federal courts have limited subject matter jurisdiction. State courts have general jurisdiction. So the cases you're hearing are much different, and they're defined by the jurisdiction you're in. State courts often have fewer resources than federal courts to do a lot of the same jobs. That's not always true. It depends a lot on what state you're in and how much funding there are for state judiciaries. So that's something to keep in mind. The appointment process is very different and leads to different types of people who sit on the courts. So all federal courts people are people that have been nominated by the president and then confirmed by the Senate. And that leads to, there are a lot of wonderful judges. I worked for one of them here. But that often privileges political connections or other specific types of relationships. Whereas in jurisdictions that use elections or maybe merit selection, that leads to a different kind of person who becomes a judge. So that's just something to think about. I'll also say that obviously another kind of substantive difference is the difference between state and federal constitutions. So if you're in federal courts, you're dealing with a lot of federal constitutional law. You're dealing with, substantive due process. You're dealing with Fourth Amendment search and seizure. If you're at a state Supreme Court or a state court more generally, you're thinking both about state constitutions and about federal constitutions. And I personally find the opportunity to kind of think about and interpret state constitutions to be really exciting, and one of the primary reasons that I was excited about working at a state Supreme Court specifically. So hopefully that answers some of the questions.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I just want to underline the importance of state courts now more than ever. I think that we're seeing, if we're interested in protecting individual rights, LGBTQ rights, reproductive rights, voting rights, that work is happening in state courts, and I think that there are something that we all need to be paying attention to all of the time. One question that I do get a lot from students: if you are not necessarily interested in practicing in a specific state, is it still worthwhile to apply to clerk in that state if you think that a judge would be a really good match for you?
That was the position that I took. I mean, I haven't, I'm not 10 years into my career, so I can't speak to it, but I will say that I think it is great to have a connection to the state that you want to clerk in. But I worked for just one of the most wonderful people I've ever met, Justice Melissa Hart, who does a lot of ACS things and who you all might have run into. But, I was pretty candid. I was like, if I end up in Colorado, that's great. But my interests in you are more particular. And because you're an academic, because you're someone that thinks a lot about the issues that I'm thinking about. So I would say absolutely take the opportunity. But if you know that you want to clerk or you want to live in a certain state, I think it's a really exceptional way to introduce yourself to the legal community, particularly if you didn't go to school in that legal community. So I went to school on the East Coast, and if I had wanted to start in Colorado, like clerking at the state court would have been just an exceptional opportunity to introduce myself to that community.
Excellent. Thank you so much. All right. Now, Chuck, I'd like to talk to you about your experience. I mean, you certainly went the farthest distance from where you started to clerk. So, you clerked on the High Court of Samoa, but there are also territorial courts in the Virgin Islands and Guam, in addition to the federal courts there. And both of them take law clerks. But I'd love to hear a little bit about more your experience, why you chose to go there, and what it was like clerking there.
Yeah, it was great. Frankly, I was looking for adventure, wanted to go somewhere far away where there would be exciting cultural experiences, just a new weather, new place to live, and I certainly got that in spades. The High Court of American Samoa, despite its name, is a federal Article 4 tribunal, yet it's simultaneously like the only local court. I think that's sort of a recurring theme with particularly the Pacific U.S. territories. We're talking about smaller populations, really small legal communities, and as Jake highlighted with state courts, these are courts that are going to have particularly limited resources to tackle the issues in front of them, particularly the non-federal ones. One thing generally that I think is worth highlighting about the federal Article 4 courts and Marianas Islands, Guam, as well as the Virgin Islands and the Caribbean, they go through the traditional Article 3 judge process, but they are appointed for 10-year terms, yet they remain on the bench until their successor is confirmed and takes the oath. I checked before this. I think the federal judge in Guam, her 10-year term lapsed in 2017, and no new replacement has, I think, even come before the Senate. So she is still on the bench. But there are more moving parts than a traditional federal judge, which I think as an applicant is something to pay attention to and be aware of. Specific for the High Court of American Samoa, it's so unique in that my justice, the Chief Justice, they're actually appointed by the Secretary of the Interior. It's got American Samoa has such a unique treaty relationship with the U.S. and heavy Department of Interior involvement that maybe is particularly unique amongst the territories. But if you're interested in clerking at any of these territories, they're so unique and the information can be so hard to find that it will take an investment of time to sort of even figure out the status of the court and what exactly you're applying for, as overwhelming as that can sound. But the courts also appreciate your willingness to dive in and the adventurousness that takes. So it was fun, thoroughly enjoyed it. Great work, interesting cases. The insular cases is the potential future of those cases could lead to some really interesting con law questions before all of these courts in the short term. So if you're interested in constitutional law, that's yet another reason I think it's a worthy path to look down.
Excellent. Thank you so much. All right, so moving on to specialty courts. There are quite a few specialty federal courts. We have the Court of Federal Claims, the Tax Court, the Bankruptcy Court, the Court of Appeals for Veterans Claims, to name a few. And Rashmi, can you please tell us a little bit about your experience on the federal circuit? What kind of cases did you hear? What kind of person would be a good fit for that? And any other thoughts you have about clerking on that court?
Sure. So I clerked on the Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit, which is a federal appeals court in DC. And the Federal Circuit handles a few different areas of the law. The most popular one, I guess, like our biggest caseload are patent cases. So for any patent case, it will typically originate in a federal district court anywhere in the country. But when you appeal a patent case, instead of going to the regional circuit, all patent appeals go to the federal circuit. And so that was probably over half of our docket. In addition, the federal circuit handles government contracts cases. We handle some tax cases. We handle appeals from the Court of Federal Claims. We handle appeals from the Court of International Trades, a number of international trade cases. We handle all federal employment cases. So for federal government employees who were terminated, who had some other adverse employment action, we handle those. And then we also handle veterans claims and a few other sort of, random assortment of specific cases from other courts as well. So first of all, I will say the clerking for the federal circuit was a phenomenal experience because it's located in DC. All the clerks are in one building, all the judges are in one building. It was a very social and collaborative experience, which is not the case in a lot of other regional appellate clerkships where the courthouse is sort of spread across, multiple cities or multiple states. We work on all the cases are heard before 3-judge panels. The clerks of those 3 judges, we do collaborate and discuss the cases beforehand to an extent. And so I think that made it a very unique experience. I think the benefit of a specialty clerkship for anyone who has an interest in an area of the law that's covered by one of these specialty courts is you do get a really focused experience in a couple areas of law, and you come out of that clerkship with a very strong understanding of the area of law. So for me, I'm currently a patent litigator. There was no better place for me to clerk than the federal circuit to get a really strong understanding of patent law issues and the way that the area of law has been developing, because patent law is quite complex. So I would say if you're interested in a specialty court and any of the federal courts, first and foremost, you should be interested in that area of law, because that is what you'll be doing. For the federal circuit in particular, because a large part of our docket is patent cases, you should at least have an interest in learning more about patent law, because you'll be spending a lot of time with that. I think a common misconception is that you have to have a technical background to clerk for the federal circuit, which it's helpful, but it's definitely not necessary. And I had co-clerks who did not have tech backgrounds who did perfectly fine with all of our, computer and semiconductor cases that we got during the course of the term. But I'd say the biggest thing you should have for any of these specialty clerkships is an interest in the area of the law, or at least a willingness to learn more about that and to really go, have a deep dive into the area of the law.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Rashmi. So Isabella, I think that we resolved the issues. Are you able to?
Yes, can you hear me?
Wonderful. Yes. Yeah. Oh, good. I'm so glad we got you online. All right. So backing up first a little bit, since you didn't get to tell us how you got your clerkship, let's start there. You're clerking now in Northern District of Illinois, one of the busiest districts in the country. Tell us a little of your story of how you got there.
Sure.
Isabella? Oh. I think we're reconnecting, so hopefully this will work.
Can you
Yes,
you
we're
hear?
back on. Perfect.
I'm sorry, I have an unstable connection in the district court here. I am not sure what's going on, but thank you again for bearing with me. So I am currently in Chicago, the Northern District of Illinois. I'm clerking for Judge Rowland. The way I got this clerkship was actually through connections. So I had a friend from law school who knew that Judge Rowland was hiring, and she was hiring for someone with a little bit more work experience. And I had 4 years at that point. And so she kind of was like, Judge Rowland's looking for a specific kind of person with this background. I think you're somebody she might be interested in. Would you be interested in applying? And I did. I applied and I got the interview, and kind of here I am. So just, I guess, emphasizing this idea that relationships are important and you never know who can tell you about an opportunity that, might not be as public.
Excellent. So can you tell us a little bit about your day-to-day as a federal district court clerk?
Absolutely. So we get a ton of motions for summary judgment, motions to dismiss, but we also get different kinds of motions like judgment on the pleadings and things along those lines. And essentially what 95% of my day is writing draft opinions for judge to look over and edit, and then get out. We also see a ton of trials, not as much as you might expect before you're in practice. A lot of things do settle or plead out, because at the district court, you do see civil cases as well as criminal cases. But I have been able to see quite a few trials, judges' sentencings as well, which are very informative and can be very emotional. But I think for a clerk, you should go see those if you are able to do so. And again, most of my day is just writing, interacting with my co-clerks and judges, and it's a small chambers, and it's a great fit.
Excellent. In addition to the different types of jurisdictions, there are also different types of courts. Isabella, you're on a trial court. You told us a little bit about that. Also, the work differs, of course, across trial and appellate courts. Jake, or Rashmi, I saw that you have something you want to add on that. And also, Jake, I know that you clerked for both a mid-level appellate court on the 10th Circuit, or you are now, and for a court of last resort on the Supreme Court, Colorado. Can you talk a little bit about that difference too?
Yeah, sure. I'll be quick because I'm eager to get to questions. But the main difference is that, at a court like Isabella's, you have a single judge and they are kind of the king or queen of their courtroom, right? They're in charge of everything that's going on. They rule on everything. If you don't like what they say, you bring it up to a panel of an intermediate appellate court. That's normally the same whether you're in state or federal court, generally heard before a panel of 3 people. That's the kind of court that I'm on now. We don't get to choose the cases we hear. Right, so most people have an appeal as of right from the trial court to the intermediate appellate court, be that state or federal. So the cases that I'm working on now, there's no selection process. The judges don't get to opt in or opt out of cases, unless they're recused or have some other reason to not be on the case, which means that we're working on any number of issues, whether or not it's resolved law in kind of an easier case or a more difficult kind of procedurally complex case. That differs a lot at the kind of apex level or the court of last resort level, whether you're at the federal US Supreme Court or at most state Supreme Courts. The key difference there, I think, is that you often have what we call cert processes or a discretionary docket. So most courts of last resort get to choose the cases that they hear, with some exceptions for original jurisdiction. So last year, a major part of my job was evaluating petitions for certiorari, which is just someone asking and saying, hey, Supreme Court, the intermediate appellate court decided this and they decided it incorrectly, and would you mind taking it? So at the Colorado Supreme Court, we write what we call cert memos, which just says, I've read this cert petition and I really think the court should or shouldn't accept it. Another key difference about working on a court of last resort is that the court has a static membership. So at the Colorado Supreme Court, there are 7 justices. They don't sit in panels. So you are working very similar. Rashmi was talking about the federal circuit, how everyone's kind of in the same hallway and they're all working together. That's even more true at a court of last resort like the Colorado Supreme Court, although different courts have different dynamics, where it's a highly collaborative experience, not only within your chambers, but also across the court, because you're all working on the same cases, you're all reading the same briefs. So I really loved that aspect of working at a court of last resort, is that everyone is working on the same things. That also means that it's the same 7 people deciding basically everything. So that's a really different experience from a court like I'm on now, where we sit for 3 or 4 days every 2 months, and each day is a different panel of 3 judges. So there's a real diversity of people that we're working with in the panel system, but not much of a diversity in the system when you are on a static court like the Colorado Supreme Court. So I would say those are a few of the really salient and important differences between the two. I would say that Supreme Courts are more focused on taking cases that have interesting and challenging questions of law and that need to be resolved to move the law forward, whereas federal circuit courts don't have the same kind of selective abilities and have to rule on the questions in front of them. So they're two very different, I think, they serve two different purposes. And that's important to think about when you're considering what you want to apply to.
It's very interesting. Thanks, Jake. So is there anything anyone else can jump in right now for the difference between, and I don't think we have anyone here who's clerked on both types, but why somebody might decide to go for a trial court versus an appellate court and what the differences in the day-to-day would be, or who would be better suited for what?
One thing I'll just add, and I say this since Judge Hughes also sits by designation in the District of Delaware, so his clerks had sort of a mix of, we had our federal circuit work and then we had our Delaware work. I think the biggest difference I noticed was just the kind of like the behind the scenes work happening at the appellate level was a really fun part of the job. So we would have a tradition called Clerk to Clerks the week before hearings, where you know, in addition to talking about the case and talking about where our judges were kind of leaning or feeling about the case, we also had the chance to sort of persuade the clerks a little bit if there was any disagreement on how a case should turn out, which I found was one of the most fun parts of the job, was to really sort of kind of go back into like high school or college debate mode and really talk about the issues and why we thought you know, that the panel should go one way or the other. The other fun part, given that you know, with the federal circuit, patent law issues are rarely taken up by the Supreme Court. So we knew for a lot of our patent cases that we were like the last word on the issue. So going through the process with the three judges on the panel, not just how the court wants to come out, but also sort of how do we even want to write the opinion to avoid sort of, you know, a domino effect and other issues, was another really fun part of the job. And I think sort of having that, the intellectual aspect of that experience was for me a very rewarding part of the job. I think by the other hand, the trial side there was definitely, I think, a lot more activity. For the cases that I had, I feel like it was a lot more sort of case management oriented and sort of helping the parties kind of figure out a path forward and sort of, you know, resolving. We had a lot of discovery motions when I was clerking, so there's a lot more of like a management aspect, and it kind of felt more, not quite like mediating formally, but like just a lot more like figuring out like, okay, for, you know, for this discrete issue, like what can we do to sort of help, you know, move the case forward or along those lines. And that in of itself has a lot of, you know, reward as well. Although definitely, you know, depending on how you feel about sort of corralling angry attorneys, it can vary a bit. But those are kind of the main differences that I noticed. Was more of like a case management side, sort of more straightforward types of writing versus on the appellate side, it was, I think, just a little bit more sort of complex at that stage.
Thank you for that perspective. That's very helpful. I know there's much more to say about this, but I do want to move on to our next topic of how you decide on which judges to apply to. And I want everyone to weigh on this. But Isabella, I wanted to start with you because one thing I do hear a lot from students who are getting set to apply is I'm only going to apply to federal judges nominated by Democratic presidents. And I think that's a bit of a simplistic way to look at it for a couple of reasons. But I want you to talk a little bit about your judge who was not nominated by a Democratic president and how important it was to you and how you thought about yourself and your judge in terms of the way that you are aligned or not aligned.
Absolutely. Thank you for the question. So I do agree that just looking at who has nominated that person is a little bit short-sighted, and I think you're probably missing out on some really great judges who you would have a great relationship, great working relationship and personal relationship with. My judge was nominated by Donald Trump, but she was a former federal public defender. I would consider her more of a progressive jurist. And she is somebody who cares deeply about the same things that I do. And I would not consider myself a Donald Trump supporter. And so I think that being open to looking at the background of the person that's being nominated is more important than seeing the initial of the party that's nominated them. You could be surprised in a couple ways, right? You can have a judge who is nominated by a Democratic president, and it turns out they're not as progressive as you might think that they would have been considering who nominated them. and vice versa. But also, I do know some people who have actually been really progressive and they've clerked for judges who are a little more right-leaning. And they've just had a relationship that transcends party lines because that person just happens to be a great mentor, happens to be very open to different perspectives and conversations. And they've had a great experience. So generally speaking, I think that if the person seems like somebody that you think you might get along with and somebody that you might have a good experience with, you should go ahead and apply. But again, if you're looking for somebody who's aligned with your values, looking at their background, what they did before they were nominated, could probably give you pretty good insight into where they lean.
Yeah, I think that's so important. There's so much more to a judge than just the person that nominated. And I don't, this is a bit of a tangent, but if you want to learn more about why that could be, the blue slip system in the Senate has a lot to do with it. So this is simplifying dramatically, but essentially for district court judges, you need to get the approval of the home state senators. So if the senators are from a different party from the president, you end up with a lot of judges that don't necessarily align with the president's views. They might be a compromise candidate that's moderate. They might be a mix of liberal and conservative candidates that was sort of gone through as a package deal. So, I would definitely urge people to look beyond just the letter next to the name because there's a lot more. So anyone else would like to weigh in on how important it is for your views to align with your judges or how to find judges that align with your views if that is something that is important?
If I can just add a little something. So I'll say two things. Number one, I think that as I am clerking, I've been surprised and I think pleasantly surprised by how much law is real and how little partisan affiliation matters, which I might have thought prior to clerking, it mattered a lot more in how people approached the issues. And I'll also say that if you are someone who has really strong views on particular issues and a very strong view of the law, it might actually make more sense if you see yourself as trying to push the law forward in a certain way, to work for someone who does not agree with you, to be a kind of contrary or a different voice in their particular chamber. So I think that to the extent that you're interested in adopting, in jurists taking a particular point of view or in thinking about particular theories of law, you might actually be more successful if you're with a judge who is not already inclined to agree with you based on what you know. But I will say that I do think that we overplay in all of the courts across the US the extent to which the partisan affiliation of the appointing party influences the outcome in both directions.
Yeah, I definitely agree that there's not necessarily a correlation between the nominating president and the values of the judge. I do think it's important though to do your research into whatever views or values the judge might have. And for me, as someone, I was applying as an openly LGBT candidate, there were judges that people had raised that I should consider, who, as I did some more digging, I found that they held some very unfortunate anti-LGBT views. And being me, I was like, well, I can't spend a year in that kind of an environment. And so I do think that, while you shouldn't just stop at who nominated the person, it is important though to do a closer look into the judge's values to make sure it's the judge is someone where you would feel kind of comfortable and welcome working there. And one of the best ways to do that, besides just Googling the judge, is talking to former clerks and others who may know the judge, just to get a sense of what kind of an environment you would be walking into, because clerking is a very close-knit environment. So at the federal circuit, which is it's not a political court, frankly, but it's the judge. We have 4 clerks and our judicial assistant, so it's 6 people, the same 6 people every day for a year. And you definitely want to be somewhere where you feel like you are welcome, where you can be yourself, and where you can sort of openly express your views. So I do recommend, at least, before you apply to a judge, sort of make sure that it's someone that you actually, would feel comfortable working for.
Yeah, I agree. That's really important. I also want to flag we are going to be having another panel similar to this one in the winter that's specifically focused on the process of applying to judges as a person of color, a member of the LGBTQ plus community, or a first generation law student. I don't want to glaze over this because it is so important that we're going to basically do this all over again with those issues. Specifically, how do you find a judge that not just politically or, on the issues of the case, but someone that you can feel safe with, somebody that you will be happy with for a whole year in a very, very close environment. I do want to move on a little bit to the application process itself. We've gotten a couple of questions in the comments, and I hear from students all the time. So before you apply, say you're just starting out, you're a 1L now, what can you do to set yourself up for success right from the start?
So I think the most important part of your application is going to be your recommenders, and those are relationships that you should be starting as a 1L. For me, I'm a very introverted person, so the idea of like getting to know people was a very challenging concept. But going to office hours is probably the easiest way to start that process. Just let the professor sort of get to know you more outside of class. Other ways you can approach this is if there's a professor that you really like, you can apply to be a research assistant for them, or sometimes do some other work for them. But I really want to underscore, even though you have Oscar, there are a lot of steps being made to sort of kind of even the playing field. Recommendations is a really important part of the clerkship process. For me personally, I would not have gotten my clerkship without a professor emailing in my application materials and really vouching for me directly to the judge that I clerked for. So I would say definitely focus on that, kind of starting as a 1L and really, even if you don't do the best in that class, the more someone gets to know you, the more they can say about you in their letter or their call to a judge.
If I might add something else, I would agree that recommenders is one, but I think right up there with it is writing sample. And especially if you're early in your law school career, intern for a judge, applying for a judge with from an in-chambers writing sample indicates I'm interested in clerking broadly. This isn't like a new interest, or I'm not applying just for the career level up. This is something I've been interested in during my law school journey. And B, you have just something concrete that the judge can look at and try to imagine this applied into their jurisdiction, their court. I was lucky to have that experience. I applied for a U.S. magistrate judge in Denver in law school. I would say generally, especially if you're a law student in a metropolitan area, you can kind of punch above your weight in the judicial internships you can get, which can be helpful for these applications for clerkships as you round out your law school journey. So yeah, seeking judicial internships and ensuring you get a good writing sample out of that, I think, is very helpful as well.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with that. I think as Judge Cobb said at the beginning, that's a great chance to get the kind of experience you will have in chambers. And all right, so looking at the resume, I've gotten this question in the chat and from a lot of other people. A lot of people, especially ACS members, come to law school with a lot of political stuff on their background. They worked on campaigns or other things like that. How do you feel about putting things like that on a clerkship resume? Is it looked on favorably, unfavorably? Did you all do it? Did you leave it out?
I'm happy to start, which is just, I think you got to be you. I think the federal and state benches are so diverse that I think the marginal cost, the marginal benefit of taking stuff that you've done off versus the marginal benefit that someone might actually see that resume and really want someone who's politically engaged. And this is true for all judges. You have no idea what judges want. And every judge is looking for something entirely different. And so my recommendation would be, unless it's something that is just universally kind of people are disinterested in, I think if it's anywhere within something that's reasonably mainstream, you should keep it on, unless you will be uncomfortable doing that. But I don't think that there are so many more judges who are going to reject your application than there are judges who will be interested in that kind of civic and political engagement. The one exception that I'll say to that, and I'm curious for other people's thoughts, is if you're targeting someone who's very, very specific, and you know that they have an expressed policy for or against something, that would be the only reason that I would think to kind of tailor your resume to that person. But in the absence of that, I would really encourage you to present your full self, because that's who's going to show up to work. And we're nonpartisan in the work that we do,
and emphatically committed to the rule of law. But if those are the beliefs that you held before, it might be true that those are the beliefs that you're going to hold after as well.
Yeah, I would agree. I would just say you have to be yourself. You don't know what a judge is going to find attractive, what a judge is going to like. I always say that there's a judge for everyone, whether your identity is if we have a certain identity or a certain religion or a certain politics, there's a judge for you, whatever that may be. And if you show up authentically as yourself, you'll ensure that you're with a judge and in a chambers where you can continue to be authentically yourself.
Excellent, thank you. We've gotten quite a few questions about the question of timing for the applications, whether it's better to go right after law school or to wait a few years. I know we've got a mix here there. So if anyone would like to talk about their experience going straight from law school or working a little while and then clerking?
Yeah, so I actually worked for 4 years before clerking, and Judge Rowland was specifically looking for that. She does hire folks out of law school, usually just one person. I think having 3 folks straight out of law school would kind of be a steep learning curve for everybody involved. So judges, as far as I know, typically don't do that as much anymore. I think that they've moved kind of towards this idea of having folks with work experience, at least in the Northern District of Illinois. I know that to be true. I think that the benefit of waiting a year or two to clerk is that, one, the learning curve won't be as steep. 2, I think that your pool of judges you can apply to is wider. And then 3, I think having the litigation background and seeing cases in live action and then seeing them, on the side of things afterwards, you have a different perspective. And I think it makes the job a little bit easier. I think if I had went straight through, my learning curve definitely would have been steep and it would have been a different experience, maybe not as enjoyable. But I do know plenty of folks who did go straight through and they also had a great experience. So it's really whatever works best for you in your career. Again, there's a judge for you wherever you may be.
Yeah, I agree. So I worked in patent law for about 2 years before I started my clerkship, and I applied the summer right after I graduated. And ultimately I applied after my 2L year. I didn't get anything, so I reapplied after graduation. And I am very glad I worked for a couple of years as well. I think it gave me a lot more context for what I was seeing when I got to my clerkship, and it also, because again, I was focusing on patent law, having worked in patent law for 2 years sort of gave me a better understanding of the issues I would be seeing when I got to my clerkship. So I felt a lot more prepared going into my clerkship with a couple of years of experience. I also think that if you clerk a couple of years into your career, it's also a really good time to sort of take that year or 2-year clerkship period to sort of reevaluate your next steps going forward. I ended up going straight into big law after I graduated. The year gave me some time to reflect on kind of what I wanted to do more long term, whether it was stay in big law or go elsewhere. I am, back in big law now. I'm at Latham here in DC. But I think having that year to sort of reset and really make an intentional choice for my next step was very valuable as well. So, I've noticed with my colleagues at the federal circuit, almost all of us had at least a year of experience before we started clerking, and I think we generally felt better for it. But it's also, not to just, for anyone here who does apply after the 2L year and if you don't get anything, do not feel discouraged at all. I think if anything, I was a much stronger applicant after, all 3 years of law school. And I think a lot of people probably were as well. So there's absolutely no harm in applying after your 2L year, but if you do end up having to reapply or you choose to wait, I think there are a lot of benefits to that as well.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think another thing that I've heard from many judges that I've spoken to is that working is something that they not just they really value, but it shows the person's full capabilities. I know that there's a lot of us who their first year law school grades don't necessarily represent their full potential, and it takes a little while to get their stride. So it's difficult to apply as a 2L under those circumstances when you're applying with a whole crush of people. But once you have that work experience, you're outside of the Oscar cycle, you're able to show yourself as a lawyer. That's a way to sort of make yourself stand out, even if you didn't have perfect grades your first year. It's a way to get connections in your field, in your jurisdiction. So I would definitely say that, don't give up if you don't get on the first try. It seems like a smaller and smaller number of people are, and yet there are many, many options to clerk after that. All right, we are running low on time, but I do want to talk about the interview process, and for the people who are fortunate enough to have an interview, any suggestions you have into going into that, how to prepare for an interview.
I would say you have to talk to former clerks of that specific judge. You don't know how the interview is going to go. I've heard all sorts of things in terms of the different interviews judges have. You have to reach out and talk to a former clerk of that specific judge to know what to expect. And then also do your research on the judge, of course. I'm sure a judge is interested in why you're interested in them. And if you don't have a good answer for that, that's probably not going to bode super well. So know the judge you're applying to, talk to former clerks, and be yourself.
There was a question in the chat for you specifically, Isabella. What did you do before you clerked, for people who are interested? Like, what kind of a job might you get before you start your clerkship? Or anybody else can answer that. Rashmi, I know you were a patent attorney.
Sure. So I'll be very short and just say I was in federal civil rights. I was at a litigation boutique called Lovie & Lovie here in Chicago, and I mainly handled 1983 civil rights related cases. Excellent.
All right, we've got 2 minutes left, and I'm very sorry we didn't get to everyone's questions. I will say there will be a follow-up email. This conversation was recorded, and that will have some more information about the ACS resources I mentioned at the beginning. One of those benefits is, as Isabella pointed out, connections to former law clerks, because that is really the best way to learn about judges and to find out about them before your interviews. But if anyone has any last words of advice, or this is the moment.
Yeah, I'll say someone mentioned this earlier, just like do your research on the judges. And if you interview with someone and the vibe is off, you do not have to take that job. Your happiness is worth a lot more than a year of pain. And that's not to say that necessarily, the judge is a bad person, but just you work so closely with these people that you need to be sure you're going to have a good relationship. And so if anything about the process feels off, my strong encouragement, and obviously there are a lot of other factors to consider, but my strong encouragement is that if you don't think it's going to be a great year for whatever reason, there are other opportunities. And I would emphatically encourage you to pursue those other opportunities. I know it sounds maybe arrogant to say no to a judge, but think of it as an employer-employee relationship, because that's all that this is, right? That's all that you're doing, is working for someone who's going to be your boss. And is that person going to be a nice boss? And if they're not going to be a nice boss, or not even if they're going to be a nice boss, but if you're going to have a bad relationship, you don't have to say yes. Your clerkship office might tell you have to. You do not have to say yes.
Yeah,
this is about you. This is about what you need.
I agree. And I'm having talking to people who had bad clerkship experience, a bad clerkship is worse than no clerkship, for sure. It is a really devastating thing. All right, anybody else before we close out?
Just to encourage people to clerk right after law school if they want to. I obviously clerked in American Samoa, 6,000 miles away from, I'm now a legal aid attorney in Selma, Alabama. You'd think that Venn diagram doesn't have a ton of overlap, but I know I'm a better day one attorney than I would have been without it. So clerkship will make you a better attorney. Being an attorney will help your clerkship. It's circular and just really good opportunity overall.
Yeah, and there really is a clerkship for everyone. I mean, even if you weren't top of your class, or even if you're not at a T14 school, there really is a clerkship and a judge for everyone. So definitely encourage, applying if you're interested.
Absolutely agree. And don't give up. It can be a discouraging process, but I've seen the people who persevere the most are the ones who end up finding the right judge for them. All right, on that note, thank you to all of you so much for giving your time. I hope you all have a great rest of your week and a good afternoon. And to all of you listening, thanks so much for spending this afternoon with us. Goodbye.